Hi everybody, today I'm going to put a replacement small chain ring on my fat bike, and the crank type is one I'd never seen before. It's an Thirteen TRS and you need a different kind of puller to take the crank off, and it's a bit of a fiddle. So I bought the new puller and it comprises, you can just see that, it's on the right. There's the knurled threaded part on the right. Just to the left of that there's a threaded insert, and then there's a replacement nut and washer and the new chain ring. I've got a set of Allen keys here, and you need an 8 and a 10 and a pipe just to give me some leverage on the end of the Allen keys. So the first thing I'm going to do now is use an 8mm Allen key to take off this nut here on the end of the left hand crank. So the nut is loose now, and we can see how I did it with my 8mm key slotting deep within, and the box span I used to get extra leverage. This allowed me to loosen this all the way off. We're now ready to put this threaded insert into the bike, and I'll dip it in some grease first and then screw it all the way in. After which this part here threads into the crank and we'll begin the extraction. So I'll now put this part in deep within, and it needs to be all the way in so that this part can go into the crank arm, so you can't see any of the threads still sticking out. And I'm going to do that now. This threaded insert is actually screwing into the spindle that runs through the frame. This outer part sits within the crank. And I'll need to back off the inner part far enough that I can get all the threads hidden in here. And this is a 10mm Allen key that screws this in, but it needn't be too tight as long as all the threads have disappeared within the crank arm itself. One thing I should have said was that this remained inside the crank arm after I removed the bolt. So in order to get a bit extra depth on the threads of the screw-in part, I've just removed that washer, and I'll put the screw-in part back in now. Here it is here, and I'll put it in as deep as it will go. We're now ready to unscrew the inner threaded part which sits within the spindle, and as it unscrews it will bear against the back of this, which is being greased, and effectively force the crank arm off the spindle. So I'm going to put the extension now on here to give me extra leverage, because I know it will be very tight, and remove the crank arm. So the crank arm is off. The threaded part sits on the 8mm Allen key. This part has to be removed from the crank arm, and here we have the end of the spindle, which is like a triangular section. Now I should be able to tap that through to take the crank arm off the other side, and that will give me access to the inner ring, 4 Allen bolts, and I'll be able to swap that over. On this side I've just found a little plastic washer that comes off. I'll take that off and put it down here, whoop, beside the larger one that goes on. So we have the crank arm, the large plastic washer, the thin plastic washer. These all have to go back on when I remount the crank. But meanwhile, I'm going to use my large rubber mallet to tap the crank out from this side. The crank arm has started to slide through the frame now, and I was hitting it with the rubber mallet, but because I ride the bike on the sand and in the sea, I think it was partially seized in there. So I've not just had to use a rubber mallet, I'm afraid I've had to use the steel mallet. But it's moving now, and I think it will slide out and we'll get this chainring replaced. It's getting pretty rough now. So the other end of the bearing surface is now binding on the bearing on the drive side. So if I had to fit this chisel in, it slides all the way in, the wrong way around, and use that as a drift. And I'm now hitting the far end of the chisel, this end, and that's driving out the crank from the other end. It's a bit rough, but I have no choice, and we're nearly there now. So here we are with the crank arm out now, and you can see the rust at either side. I need to clean all this up, clean inside the hub there, grease it all, reassemble it. But first, of course, I have to take off the 4 little bolts and get this chainring changed over. I've removed 2 of these little bolts now, with 2 to go. But it's as well to use an extension on the 5mm Allen key when you're taking these bolts out. They're not particularly tight, but it keeps your hands away from the teeth on the cogs here, and then prevents you tearing your knuckles. I've given everything a fairly good clean now, but to get the rust off these bearing surfaces, I'm going to try and use this brass brush, which shouldn't be too harsh on the steel surface and take any size out the diameter and cause me problems with looseness. So I'll give this brush a bit of a try and see if I can get these polished up. The bearing surfaces are nice and shiny now, although I must confess to using some 240 grit emery just to kind of get the finish I wanted on those. And now I'm going to use just some multi-purpose grease on all the screws and when I reassemble the little chainring, and then get it all back together. When putting these little bolts back in, try and start them off by hand, because the threads are fine, and if you cross thread them you can damage the crank. So each of them I'll just try and screw them in gently by hand to start with, before getting an Allen key on and doing the final tighten. When tightening anything like this, where you have bolts on a circumference, I tend to try and tighten them diagonally first. So I'm going to tighten this one here, bottom left, then over here and do the top right, and then I'll come to this one, and then finally to that one. I'm sure it doesn't make a great deal of difference, but that's the way I like to do it. And also these will have to be very tight. These can work loose over the course of a summer's pedaling, and I've snapped one of these before, an aluminium inner ring, because I've lost bolts and then snapped the ring. So be very careful with those. I was cleaning this up before reassembling it, and when I put my finger in, you may be able to hear that isn't sounding too good. I think the bearing on this side needs replaced. The one on the other side is fine, but it's worth checking. Although I only disassembled this to do the chainring, I'm now going to have to source and fit a new bearing on this side. But I'll reassemble it all together for the moment, for the sake of the video, and so I can pedal around until the new bearing arrives. All greased, ready to go back in. This is the crank arm ready to go back on. Grease this cup here, grease the triangle. I found 2 spacers rather than just one when I took it to pieces. I'm now going to put this on 180 degrees out to the crank on the other side, and then by simply tightening the crank bolt, the one with the 8mm key, it'll pull it all together and we're ready to go. The bolt, the washer, and always grease the threads. And as ever, locate it by hand first before using an Allen key. Done. And this bolt tightens clockwise, as we mentioned earlier, and I used the box spanner to get that good and tight put huge force through the pedals on a bike, so that needs to be very, very tight indeed. Thanks for watching.